This week in the conversation, I have the honor to receive an old friend, Fazle Chowdhury. He's going to be speaking with us, talking about a very interesting book titled The Other Side of Eden. But before we get to this very interesting story, interesting book, I also would like to remind you about my own titles, the twin books published simultaneously, one last year and one this year. Book one is titled Bittersweet Memories of Last Spring, and book two is Last Spring Was Bittersweet, which is a sequel to last year's publication. So I'm encouraging you, as the holiday season is upon us, to take a moment, if you interested in Caribbean slash South Florida multicultural stories. So this is a story you wouldn't want to miss. So I am encouraging you to do the best you can to get your hands into these two books. But where can you find them? Okay, the books are available everywhere they sell books, including Walmart. So I always like to say that. So yeah, if you want to support my writing journey, this is the best way to do so. Also, just before we get to the main conversation with writer Fazle Chowdhury, I just want to remind you also to support this conversation. And if you like the story, don't forget to hit the like button at the end of the video. Without further delay, so let's get started. Again, my name is Ardain Isma, and I'm here this evening, but could be this morning or this afternoon. It depends on where you are across the world, with an impeccable author, my good friend, Fazle Chowdhury. And he's with me with a new book. It has a fantastic new title. Actually, was published back in 2020. But right now, the book also has been revitalized. I mean, he's been on a mission to present this wonderful story before the world, and specifically before you viewers, before you avid readers. He's here. We're going to talk about the story, but also we're going to talk about his future projects also, because I know he's a prolific writer. So, Fazle, welcome again to the conversation.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you, Ardain, for having me.
Okay. So, no, we know this story was published back in 2020, and you still on the promotion, campaign behind it. Why do you think you still do you think you still the need to continue to?
Well, it was interesting because this book came out right at the center of the pandemic period, and while there was some events we had done primarily online, there were, as time went by and the readers reached out to me saying, I wish you told me more about the principles of this philosophy that you included, or why didn't you speak more about this relationship between the prince and the sultan? Why didn't you speak about even this kind of this small section which you wrote? But when I read it again, there was so much story to this, and so I felt a little how do I say it? I felt like there were certain explanations that needed to be said to really captivate readers who really were interested in this kind of a story. And truth be told, this story is one of the complaints I had with some of my more consistent readers was that the prologue was the longest chapter, and I had not realized it in the course of writing it, because the whole idea behind it was to create a foundation, create a setting. But I guess in that context, I had done too much of it. But one of the things that I also found out later on was that readers appreciated more on the sense of how symmetric the story became
Hmm.
later on. It's almost like saying you've created a foundation that is so solid, and then later on, whatever happened on top of it was simply easier to understand and digest.
Hmm.
Although there were some readers who also said to me that I wish I had done a lot more time or contributed a lot more time in the character development of some of the intermediaries and the characters around this story, because it felt as though there were so many things going on. And if you did not read slowly and carefully, you could miss some really crucial facts, which unfortunately I bear full responsibility for. And I made sure that I've not done that in my other projects.
Hmm.
So, yes.
And you know what? One thing I also realized as a writer, I'm speaking from the writer's perspective, things you write in stories and you think that are somehow irrelevant, but you have them there just to push the story along,
Mhm.
sometimes can turn out to be, one of the most relevant to the majority of the readers. So sometimes you don't really know unless you're in the reader's mind.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very difficult because I remember I did a reading in the end of uh 2021 or 2022, I forget, but a group of really college students was saying to me that, we really love this angle you've taken from, like, what it is. The story begins, I mean, just to your viewers, the story begins in the middle of a party. It starts in the middle of a party. It's a grand party. There's like lots of guests. It's in a palace, but there are a lot of things that are happening
Mm.
in the midst. And so one of the readers who had said to me said that, I wish you had put the party scene in the middle, because like throughout the entire story, I was trying to look for what is going wrong. And like, I could sense there's something horrible that was going to happen. And I wish I knew what was going to happen, but I couldn't. And I said, well, how did you feel towards the end? And she said, I felt very empty. I felt so empty because I
Yeah.
felt as though like I did not anticipate this.
So how, right?
I mean, she was quite upset. She said, you can't end it right there. You can't really end it right there. And I said, well, I'm sorry. There's not much you can do. But she was very upset.
And you know what? When readers are telling you this, also they want you to continue with the story. They want you to write another book on top of it. And sometimes you can't really please everyone, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know why readers would say that the prologue, is the longest chapter. It may be, but it sets the stage for
Yeah.
what would be coming next.
Mhm.
Well written, and it begins with an intrigue to me with this man, okay, and his son
Yeah.
navigating to me what I can see as an unforeseen world.
Mhm.
And his son was tired, but he dragged along with his dad anyway to a journey for me from the point of view of a reader, that's still unknown to me, to a destination that's quite unknown to me.
Mhm.
Yet I still don't know his name and the name of his son. Could you please tell? You don't want to tell the story now, but could you
Yeah.
please, give us?
So the prologue is really a setting where about and this actually happened uh, in a real setting where an area in where we consider today between Iran and Iraq, an area was desecrated. And it was desecrated by bandits thinking that this area had enormous gold and diamonds, which it did for some time, but not that time when it happened. And so populations had to flee, and numbers, some fled towards modern day Turkey, but a lot fled towards modern day India.
Mhm.
And and the reason why I wanted to capture that moment is because it at that time when I was writing, and I started writing this book back in 2016, 2017, which was which I mean, I I I was thinking about it more in terms because at that time I was really writing this non-fiction book on Iran at the time, and I uncovered so many historical facets around what was happening 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and it's very difficult to like turn those things around when you write a fictional story such as this. But the main emphasis around it was really I wanted to create a foundation between a relationship between a father and son,
Right.
and what it meant for a father to care for this boy that he had, the only thing that was left in his life after so much has been lost or had been lost. And so I was hoping to capture that in this long journey and this long perilous journey. And much of the contents of that, I mean, when I first started writing it, I remember a friend of mine saying, well, you can't anticipate a 5-year-old to survive this. It's a very difficult set of climates, difficult terrain. There's no way a 5-year-old can survive this. You need to make this person a little older. And I was just thinking to myself, I was like, well, I mean, okay, I mean, this doesn't really bode well to what I was intending to. But then another friend of mine said to me, well, don't worry about the age. Let's leave it blank. Okay, keep on writing what you're writing, and then, we'll figure it out later. And by the time I actually got to, which was 2020, and I was doing the finishing touches, it was just a very different setting I had of myself, the experiences I had in those course of those last 4 years. And I said, I knew what the story was going to be. I knew how to angle it. But the main purpose behind that was to show that there was this deep love between a father and a son. And that actually reciprocated in the next generation afterwards. Which the story actually kind of unfolds. And so to answer your question, as much as the story is an adventure, there's a lot of tense emotions, but also kind of like what all fathers have with their sons, in the sense that, this element of protection, this element of survival, this more element of prosperity between one generation to another. And that was something I wanted to capture.
Now, The Other Side of Eden, it's the title. Do you have the book with you by any chance to control to the audience? You don't have it, but that's okay. That's okay. That's okay.
I'm sorry, I don't keep any of my books.
That's okay.
Which is a
That's
problem.
okay. But we'll have it, for them. Don't worry. Now, 1883 is a period many things happened between Western Europe, and I'm talking about many international conferences. That's when industrial Europe began to look elsewhere in terms of solidify the position as the Industrial Revolution continued. We had the Conference of Berlin, 1883, by the way, which partitioned Africa, right? Yeah. Which led to a major conference in London in 1900, try to stave off, European influence. And then you have later on in the 1910s, following World War I, you have the Balfour Declaration, which in the same area that you're talking about, your story is developing. So that's when the British Empire in particular, really took a major lead in partition different countries. Sometimes, the result turned out to be some of the contemporary tensions that we have between different countries in the Arab world or Muslim world, so to speak. Did you have that in mind, Fazle, when you because you say 1883 and you just tell me it's an area between what is now Iraq and Iran, Mesopotamia or something?
Yeah. So the incident, the horrible incident did happen, but it didn't happen in 1883. As a matter of fact, it happened much earlier.
Much earlier.
But the reason why I picked 1883 was for another reason. One was because it was really around the fact that the center of migration between what happened in the Middle East around 1800s, even towards the latter parts of as the 1800s were nearing to an end, you see a number of migration, but the migration was very contained into a limited area. Okay.
Okay.
But one migration that particularly was very familiar to me, mainly because of the roots of my family, was how much of Persian populations had come over to India.
Okay.
And this actually played well to some of what we see in the diversity of that region now.
Are you talking about the middle of 19th century or what?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. And you know, I mean, there's a thriving amount of commerce, there's a thriving amount of industrialization, but you know, I mean, it's not as prosperous as Europe, but it's still kind of like baby steps. And so one of the things that I wanted to capture on this time was primarily colonialism, and how
I could see that.
as you can see, was the fact that, you know, you had colonial powers in different areas, but they were primarily safeguarding their interests as they had, kind of like their patron on the throne, to make sure that it looked legitimate. There was a way to control the local populations. And similarly, in this story, there is a similar line here. You know, there's the Sultan who's really, you know, I mean, he's not just a king. He serves in the British Air Force during World War II. He is, in some cases, really much of a hero, but he's not recognized as well because he's the king of this isolated kingdom up in the mountains. And there's enormous wealth in these mountains. There's enormous kind of intellectual bourgeoisie slash intelligentsia, but all that is really pigeonholed in one specific area. So it's kind of like, you know, if the rest of the areas are not really fully integrated, then you will not know how prosperous this area is, which it is.
As you can see today, it's clearly manifested.
That's right, yeah. And so, like, you know, based on what you said, certainly along the lines of, and I try to steer it more towards colonialism, because in one sense, you had this king who really wants to develop this kingdom that he has, but the only thing he has full control over is his elite guard. And this is the elite guard that maintains security, maintains his own security. But at the same time, there are problems. There are problems within the loyalty of these men. There are problems between just the way how everything is functioning. And keep in mind, the story is actually, you know, as it weaves between the late 1800s and over towards the end of 1947, there are the progression of problems actually develops throughout the story, you know. And, you know, yes, it's political, but the storyline is really of what this does to a ruler. You know, if you look at the stories of, you know, even African chiefs during the time, they ruled with a degree of honor. They ruled with a degree of etiquette, and there was a principle that they abide by. But as soon as they encounter this kind of colonial space, the foundations begin to crack. And I tried to mimic that in this story, where the Sultan should know about this, and everybody around him is urging him, telling him that, you know, things are not working, but he seems to be aloof to it. In reality, he is well aware of it, but it looks like to an average reader that he is just focused on two things. One is the fact to maintain the status quo, and the other is this question mark. And nobody seems to understand what his number one priority is. His generals don't know, his politicians don't know, and many of his closest officers are dying because of assassination plots or even like problems at the border. And somehow there is no reaction within this king. And so throughout the story, I tried to get the reader to be more and more curious. What is driving this? Is it love? Is it something else? Is it an old kind of trauma? Is it something that he's done that he regrets, that he's so silent about? What is it? And I've proven as many kind of etiquettes or possibilities that I could, from like, you know, issues between his own family to issues with the woman he ends up marrying, and there's the section of and there's actually the section of where I tell the story about how, at a parade, he's not to give not to give away too much to your readers, but there's this point where he's just waiting, and as a reader, I tested this to see, like, okay, does this make the reader agitated or trying to understand, or are they completely freaked out by something horrible is going to happen? And I'm not going to give it away, but as you will see, that he is in full control of what he does. What he is not so confident about is what is about to happen, which he suspects will happen because of what he's done.
And let me ask you something. Are you trying to remind the world of the power behind uh I mean, when someone has been empowered in the mission to rule a country or a kingdom, even though that the country or this particular kingdom is crumbling around him, but he still doesn't see the need to let go. Do you think it's the fear of the unknown that would propel any king or any queen to hang on to something that obviously everybody sees that's disappearing? Do you think so?
Let me put it to you a little differently. In my professional life, I've worked with executives, I've worked with really division leaders who have a philosophy that this is the way how things are going to get done, and this is how things will pan out. Now, I can certainly tell you that, yes, I've seen a lot of failures, and I've had different opinions on how I would think things would pan out if there were things that were done differently. But with that, when I brought those kind of experiences and I spoke to people I knew who had served in the military, people who I knew who served in the Navy, and who had done wonderful things after they retired, whether they became political liaisons or even worked in embassies, all of them, in some way, shape, or form, have told me in ways where they say that power is a very delicate thing. And if you're unaware how delicate it is, the repercussions of it, or even the mishandling of it, can consume you in ways worse than poison.
Correct.
And ultimately, you will self-destruct. And so, to answer your question, yes, there is this element of responsibility that we all have. We all believe somebody is capable of taking on a task more than what they feel they can take on. And they might have the endurance, they might have the patience, they might even have the wisdom. But is that enough? And the story is really about to say that, yes, but there are other things that are out there that we don't anticipate.
So it sounds clearly like you could be, by the way, a great historical fiction writer, because the way you pen the story, the way you build this world, and I have to say that as a compliment, when it comes to world building, you're very good at that.
Well, I appreciate you saying
this
that.
is to say that viewers, you ought to read this book to see exactly what the author is talking about. And now, do you anticipate of writing someday, or maybe it might already be one of your projects, biofiction?
Did you say biofiction, Ardain?
Biofiction.
I know authors who've done it, but it's kind of interesting.
You don't have anybody special in your intellectual mind that you would grab that person. How about maybe you mentioned India? How about a great Indian leader we know of?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that about India, and I mean, I recently I mean, it came out in August. I don't know how recent you would consider that now. I mean, it was a nonfiction book. It's really um, uh, it's a book that I spent close to, I want to say, 5 years of
Mhm.
my time, really trying to fight the time to write it. It's really about Bengal, and it's a province of India right now, and what the British Empire did to it. And
Mhm.
it's probably one of the longest books I've ever written.
Okay.
Um, but it consumes so much of my energy that at the end,
On research, right?
yes, yeah. And at the end, it just, it became very difficult to even complete it, because there was so much, and as you would know, as historians, as academics, you really have to stay true to your message. You can't exactly bring in other things which may or may not affect things.
Mhm.
But to answer your question, like, I've had a lot of friends who've done memoirs,
Mhm.
and I've always wanted to write this novel about kind of this to assimilate historical fiction with a thriller with someone who is real. And it is
That's
for any
biofiction right there.
yeah, biofiction right there. But other things come in the way. You would be surprised. I mean, like, if you when I wrote this book,
Mm.
The Other Side of Eden, I thought it was complete, but I was so passionate about writing about what was happening in Iran, what was happening between the peace negotiations in the JCPOA between the United States and Iran at the time in 2016. This had to, like, it was almost like I had two different kind of works of art that were being created at the same time. And you'd be surprised, as a writer, you're passionate about a story. You're
Mm.
passionate about telling the story in the best way you possibly can.
Mm.
Unfortunately, what happens is what you consider to be the best thing last Thursday
Mm.
is no longer the best thing the next Thursday.
Because things are moving fast, right? So
And
fast.
sometimes you as an individual are learning. You're learning how to convey a message. You're learning how to speak to a message. I mean, truth be told, I mean, I was speaking to a good friend of mine who works with refugees. She's the CEO of this wonderful nonprofit,
Mm.
Migrants of the Mediterranean. They work with
Right.
refugees,
Right.
and I spoke to her last week, and she was telling me about what was happening. And then before that, I was working on an article to be submitted. And then right after that conversation, I felt, oh my goodness, I probably did not do justice to my own work, because some of the things that I was trying to incorporate, had I not included some of the elements of what my friend was talking to me over the phone,
Mhm.
it would not make that work, would not give that work much of a justice. And so as writers, sometimes we forget about that, and the other problem is that some writers take a long time to write something.
Mhm.
And particularly for myself, I've come to understand that if you do that, yes, there is a potential that you will produce the best work, but there is a good possibility you'll be so exhausted
Good.
that you
Good.
will you will just not be able to produce or make your work as great as you probably should.
Mhm. That's true. You know, one thing I like about you, again, I have to say, you do not moralize in your story. You're not trying to create a Cornelius Shakespearean hero. You paint the story the way, society and contemporary time would clearly understand it. And that's what a good writer does, and it's a compliment. I hope I'm not the first one or the only one to have to tell you this. You do not moralize and you tell it like it is. And I like that.
Appreciate
Great
that.
writers like Marquez,
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
why people love Marquez
Mhm.
and 100 Years of Solitude. Uh,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so I like that, and I'm encouraging readers to go read Fazle's book, in particular this one, even though it was published back in 2020. But you can see what we're living right now, current, contemporary issues that the world is facing right now. You can find at least some understanding by reading the book. So interesting, and I will put the title on the screen so everybody would see that too, and then anyone who wants to follow you too. But to continue, to continue, uh, there's something I want to ask you. You have a fascination for this particular period in history. We could still consider as contemporary history too. For example, the United States is just a little over 200 years old, but is still considered as a contemporary country, right? As opposed to all Europe, so Europe in general, or Africa, or India, or China. But is there any reason why you're so fascinating with this? Is there something that you want to teach us as readers? Why you focus on
Um, to be honest with you, one of the things that fascinates me about these periods is how little we know about the daily struggles of the average person. And to be honest with you, I've always tried to bring in what I would think is somewhat of a struggle for the average person, and I would elevate that up to someone like a prince or a king. But even then, there are things that I think that there is a disconnect. One of my favorite stories that I've heard was how a man was walking down the street and he saw a number of people who were just carrying these buckets. And he immediately assumes that, they probably want food because it's that time. What he doesn't seem to understand is that there's a lack of water. And water is more important than food. So what he does is he goes to the market and buys tons of food and brings it over to these people. And the people say, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I thought you were here and you're not, like, you don't look well. Maybe you're starving." It's like, "No, we want to carry as much potable water so that we can grow our own food." Okay.
That's
Okay.
interesting. Very
So,
good.
and that story has a lot of significance to me because we can easily assume something which is simply not true. Wouldn't it be nice if we just figured out a way that this is what the answer is, instead of going back to our bubble,
True.
And so in a lot of these stories, particularly in this one, there were stories in there that I had inserted in, and I tried to mend it in the larger story. And it's actually hilarious when you think about it, because, I remember back in those days, I used to speak to a few friends of mine who were really upset with their cousins. One of them was, I believe, hated his cousin in such a way that, he was just like, oh, I would gladly send him something unpleasant so that he would realize what he has done to me. And keep in mind, you're speaking to a friend over the phone. It's the middle of a pandemic. And all this person is talking about is this kind of anger he has built inside of him. Okay.
Right.
Keep in mind, we cannot go out. We are really worried about our own lives. And so there's a level of humor there, but there's also a level of real concern that, while all this is happening, this person can only focus on these little things. And so I try to bring in those stories as well into this larger mix between something to bring humor or something to really make the reader think, like, wait a minute. You've got troops that are marching into this kingdom, and they're coming in droves, and all you can think about is that there's no dessert left in this party. Surely there's something wrong with you.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. You know what? You do not moralize in the story, and I like that. You
Okay.
paint it just like it is.
Yeah.
Now, any project you want to share with us?
Uh, there, I mean, as I mentioned, I wrote
New
a
project.
book with Blood and Flame. I mean, that's of course a history book, and for your readers who are very interested in Indian history, that is something that I spent a lot of time on, and it's still getting it's gotten a lot of positive reviews, and I'm very grateful for that, particularly in the academic circles. But as I said, I'm really hoping that I'm able to write this one novel um, on this executive who is being investigated for how come their company is amassing so much profits while at the same time they're failing audits. The other competitors are not doing well in the same industry. How is it possible? And I wanted, and I still do, I want the protagonist to be someone who's dear to me. Uh, and It's just very hard to. I haven't seen this side of their capacity to take on a lot of pressure. And I think one day, if I am able to spend about 10-15 minutes in their office, and I can get that right instance where I can understand that, this is what they look like under pressure. I think I can do that novel.
Okay.
Um,
So we're just
and
waiting for that, you know. But I mean,
um,
when do you think we might get a chance to lay our hands on it? Maybe 2025 or 2020?
I'm hoping towards the end of 2024 or early 2025.
Okay.
And I certainly will definitely introduce it to you, Ardain, when the time comes, because I
Okay.
think there are a lot of things in there that you yourself would appreciate. Certainly with the kind of
Mhm.
novels you yourself write. I mean, your novel, Midnight at Noon.
Right.
I read the first chapter and I kept on reading the first chapter. I really liked it. I really wish I could capture some of that in a setting of utter turbulence.
All the time.
Um,
Okay.
but this is the challenges of a writer, you know.
That's why a lot of people are asking me, you say, look, you know what? We need a sequel. I don't know how to write a sequel of this story. You see what I mean? Well, if Haiti would be liberated in a sense,
Right.
then that a sequel might make sense, you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, I mean, never say never.
Yeah. So any advice, Fazle, you might want to leave us with an advice for writers out there who would want to follow your path at becoming such a brilliant, historical fiction writers as you. What advice would you give? Would you want to give?
Um, to be honest with you, the best advice I got was that what you consider to be the right way to communicate to your reader may be disliked by many and more. Um, Try to shut that ear off. Put a wall on it, put a tape on it. Um, at the end, it doesn't matter. Um, if you're writing this book for someone, stay true to that someone. Um, Most of my books, I mean, this one, The Other Side of Eden, I dedicated to my grandfather. And I only knew him probably less than 9 years of my own life. Um, um, but the little I knew of him, I adored him. And I wish he would appreciate the story. And I think he would have. But then again, the perception of a 9-year-old of what a novel is to what was considered, 30, 40 odd years ago is very different now. So uh, to keep that perspective in mind.
And with that, I'm just going to say it has been just another wonderful opportunity to speak with a prolific writer, Fazle Chowdhury.
Thank you, Arda.